thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to the organizers for having me. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to be here. And thanks, of course, everybody for tuning in, despite the great weather. So what I'm going to talk about today is the behavioral ethics of human-machine interaction, and I'll just give you a short outlook of what I'm going to talk about. So, first of all, I would like to give you an idea of what I mean by behavioral ethics, and for those who are not so familiar with the concept, to make some clarifications on the term itself. And then I would like to elaborate a little bit on why I think behavioral ethics is relevant and important for the domain or for the issues around human-machine interaction. And then what I'm going to do in the middle part is talk a little bit about some, so to say, application cases. So I want to illustrate the issue with basically two studies that we've conducted in Munich. And the first is on interacting with algorithms and the idea of the role that leeway plays in ethical decision making. And then the second is more like on interacting with, so to say, embodied artificial systems, so interacting with robots. And here I'm going to talk a bit about the role of being affected and what this means for the samples that we should look at. And then in the final part of my talk, I'm going to very briefly conclude. Okay, so let's start. So what is behavioral ethics? So let me start with the observation that traditional ethics does ascribe a central role to deliberations. So you may not agree on the right normative theory, and of course we have very strong conflicts between, for instance, deontologists on one side, consequentialists, utilitarian on the other side, and they may very well disagree on a lot of issues and accordingly come to a very different conclusion, having their respective normative ethical theories in mind. So usually you could say that when you take such a normative approach, the focus is very much on how we should act when we resolve an ethical dilemma. And of course, different normative theories will come to different conclusions on how we should do that. And usually you would say, like, if you follow the tradition, so to say, we have something that you may call a rationalist model, because usually it is assumed that once people have understood what is right and what is wrong, they will, of course, act accordingly. So the issue here is you have to convince people of the right ethical theory, but once they've understood it, there is basically no reason why they should not adhere to this normative theory. And of course, you can also see, like, if you move to moral psychology, I mean, the centrality of deliberation for ethics is, of course, here exemplified by Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development. You know, that's also like an old theory, but others like Piaget have built on that, where the idea basically is, and this is, I think, very often also how we teach people ethics, for instance, business ethics in business schools. That's basically the idea that people walk from childhood to adulthood, from the pre-conventional level to via the conventional level to the post-conventional level, and people start as children and they want to avoid punishment, they want to avoid sanctions, and so on. And then in the conventional level, you know, they somehow understand that there is law, that there are certain orders, some implicit norms that they have internalized from their culture that they should adhere to. And then in the post-conventional level, you know, they start questioning these things, and they may even refuse to adhere to the ethical cultures that they are born in, right? And they apply universal ethical principles. So that's basically the idea, and the people cannot relapse. You know, once they've reached a higher stage, they will basically not fall back. And this is basically where the criticism of behavioral ethics sets in, inspired by people like Jonathan Haidt and others, that the idea is that most of us dramatically underestimate how strongly our behavior is prone to incentives and to situational factors that we, upon reflection, would not deem ethically relevant ourselves. That's the point, right? And we are particularly good at spotting misbehaviors in others, but we are not so good in spotting that in ourselves. And the idea is that most of us underestimate the tendency, and that therefore ethics, we should have also a behavioral component, and we should examine how people actually behave in certain situations. And we should assume that even though they, like adhere to a certain normative theory and they reflect on that and they say that's the way I see it, they may still very well act in contradiction to their own ethical beliefs, right? Not to the standard of some church or some external institution, right? So the idea is that traditional ethics lacks an understanding of the non-intentional cognitive factors that influence moral behavior, and that it is important to study these cognitive influences scientifically, because the important thing here is, of course, they are not just idiosyncratic noise, right, that you cannot understand because one person is behaving in this way and another person is behaving in that way, and then you're not able to get any sense out of that anyway. But there are predictable patterns in their behavior, predictable deviations, like from certain ethical standards that accordingly can be addressed. So that's the starting point for our further considerations. So why is this important for questions of human-machine interaction? So let me just describe this with the help of the infamous trolley cases. So I have to add a personal note on that. When I was a PhD student, I was an economist economics PhD student in the International Max Planck Research School, and the philosophers, that we had in there were very often using the trolleys, and I always found this a bit annoying because I said, oh, again they're having yet another trolley. But it was not. It was when I read Joshua Green's book Moral Tribes in 2013 that I thought I understood why this research is so insightful and so interesting, and now I'm using them myself. So let me just start with the observation, that in the footbridge, in the so-called footbridge dilemma, okay, what we know is, numbers may differ from study to study, but what we know is that most people are not willing to push the fat man off the bridge to save the 5 on the track. They just don't want to do this. So the majority refuses to do so in this bridge dilemma. But if we move to the switch case, to the switch dilemma, where the person can only pull the lever and deviate the trolley to the side track, where only one person gets killed, the majority of people is now willing to do so, right? And for a consequentialist, like this difference does not make much sense, because you would say, well, ultimately in most consequentialist theories of course, what counts is the foreseeable consequences of the action, mostly not the intended ones, but usually the foreseeable consequences, not what factually happens, because this may be subject to moral luck. We shouldn't think that this is morally very relevant, maybe in judicial terms, but usually not in ethical terms. And then in this case, it's completely foreseeable what happens, because in the footbridge case and in the case of the switch, it is completely foreseeable that one person will be killed here, right, for the benefit of the other 5. So in this sense, it shouldn't make much of a difference. But of course, deontologists may come to a different conclusion, right? So if you refer to Kantian ethics, of course, and the second formulation of his categorical imperative, you may interpret this in terms of do not instrumentalize others. And of course, you could say, well, in this case of the switch dilemma, I'm not instrumentalizing this person. So this is just a side effect of this person being killed, and this is also, what Christian ethics would say since St. Augustine, right? That's just a side effect, and this constitutes the difference between terror bombing, for instance, and strategic bombing, right? But here, this person is instrumental to stopping the trolley. Because it's hard to think of a more brutish instrumentalization of a person than using this person as a trolley stopper. So we might now see that there is a difference here in terms of the non-consequentialist theory, right? So we may disagree on that. And what Joshua Green then does is something that I find quite ingenious. He says, well, look, let's introduce the case of the remote footbridge, right? And what he says, and this is a stylized version of the setting, and you can see here the fat man is replaced by the workman with a backpack, so that's the more politically correct version of the original one, and Joe is here, can push the man with a backpack off the bridge on the track, right? Again, very few people are willing to do so. But if you now take a variant, so to say, a mixture of the switch case and the footbridge case, right? And you place the person like a bit remote from the tracks, and the person can now pull the lever, and the trapdoor opens, and the man falls on the track. Much more people again are willing to do so, right? So the propensity to do that increases dramatically. And then, of course, you know what Green says. It's an interesting question why that happens. It could be, you know, we've done two things. We increased, so to say, or we increased the physical proximity. Yeah, and we've also, you know, like we now have this instrument, so this artifact that we are using. And then, you know, like, yes, intermediate cases, for instance, the footbridge pole, where he says, well, now you have an artifact, simply a pole to push the person. Maybe this already makes a difference, right? Or you're standing next to the person. So in both cases, you're directly standing next to this person, but now you're using a lever, and the trapdoor opens directly next to you, and the person falls down. And it's here, it's between these two cases where you observe the hugest difference, right? So people don't say, well, I can't be deceived by that, right? That's basically the same, right? It doesn't make a difference whether I push the person with my hands or whether I use the pole, right? But it does make a huge difference whether I get this, you know, like this more sophisticated artifact which lets me drop the person down the bridge. And Green says, well, now deontologists should hesitate, right? So they should basically say, well, usually that shouldn't make a difference, should it? So if a friend would call you and ask you, shall I drop a person off a bridge to save 5? You wouldn't say, well, it depends. Can you use a pole or can you use a trapdoor? So according to most ethical theories, you would say it shouldn't make any difference, but still, empirically, it makes a huge difference. So irrespective, and that's a very important point, irrespective of where you personally stand, so what your right ethics is, or what you consider the right ethics, probably most of you would say this shouldn't matter, but it matters to subject, and it matters empirically, right? And this is why we should care about these behavioral effects that we can observe. And I think you don't need too much imagination why this has something to do with technology and the interaction with technology. Let me just give you very briefly another example. I mean, there are several studies, so this is just like two particularly simple examples where they've given Bark-Duran and others have confronted people with this trolley dilemma simply on a big screen as opposed to a small screen. So people were asked to address this dilemma on the monitor of their computer or on the smartphone. And what you see is that, again, people's judgments in both cases differ substantially, right? So more people are willing to push if they give the answer on their smartphone, and because you could say, well, probably what's happening here is that the construal level to the distance, the emotional distance to the victim is increased when people give their answer on the smartphone. I mean, there are other studies that show that if people answer the dilemma questions in a foreign language, so not in a native language, it's also apparently the case that the utilitarian ideas are triggered more, so they're also more likely to give the utilitarian answer. Another thing is that usually, you know, when we compare, and that's in a study by Voigtlis et al., but it has been replicated several times, is that usually, you know, when you measure the moral wrongness that people ascribe to an action or an inaction, you know, usually we like humans not to act, right? So if in a certain case, so even so in the case of the bridge, right, we would say, well, if a person says, I don't want to push this person, we usually understand that. That's something that we appreciate. We say, I fully understand that you do not push this person. And even Peter Singer says, I don't want to be befriended. I don't want to make friends with a person who would push another person off the bridge to save 5, but still it would be the morally right thing to do, even though I don't want to be friends with such a person, right? So if we judge humans, right, usually we have this, so to say, action-inaction bias. So we judge this very differently. And this changes. This basically turns around when we judge the actions of a machine, right? So if a machine is inactive, right, we very often find this problematic, because the machine should have done something where we like the human not to do something, right? In completely symmetric cases, we come to a very different conclusion. So again, regardless of where we personally stand and how we personally see that issue, we should care that this makes such a huge difference, depending, you know, on the agents that we are judging. And this is something that we learn, obviously, here from these studies, and if we conduct experiments on these issues where we actually look at people's behavior, because these are systematic behavioral tendencies. Yeah. So what I would like to do in the next step is I would like to show you some experiments, you know, like where we investigate people's actual behavior, you know, like in certain situations. And the first thing that I'm going to address is the interaction with algorithms. And here we were investigating in a study that we conducted in the laboratory before, you know, the lab was shut down, before the pandemic started. And this is on the role of leeway in ethical decision making. So let me just start off with the observation that one prominent objection, at least against self-learning algorithms, is that their opacity seems to be particularly problematic, especially in the domain of ethics. So if we, you know, like, if we can decide whether to use an algorithm to improve the return of investments of our stocks, you know, we might well hand over to this algorithm, because we say, well, we have a clear metric here, right? And if the thing improves my return on invest, I don't really care whether it's opaque or how it does that, as long as, you know, it is successful on the stock market. While if the algorithm takes ethically relevant decision, right, if it is about, I don't know, like predictive policing, or if it is about parole decisions of judges, or so, like things that directly have ethical consequences, we say, well, look, if we don't understand why the system is taking a certain decision or making a particular recommendation to the judge, right, how can we decide whether it is an ethical decision? So we may particularly want transparency in these issues. So this is something, at least, you know, that you notice that's very much discussed in the literature. You could say this is basically the iconic image, you know, like of the black box from Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. You know, say we are basically maybe like the apes jumping around this huge black box, and going crazy about the fact that we're not understanding what's going on in there. The impression that we had is that there is more to people's documented aversion against interacting with algorithms in the moral domain. And one idea, if you look into the Bertelsmann study, you know, they've conducted this study in Germany, what Germany thinks and feels about algorithms or something like that, and they've done this then for the whole of Europe again in 2020. And here's one quote: "Algorithms might be objective, but I feel uneasy. I feel uneasy if computers make decisions about me. I prefer humans to make those decisions." Right. So that's a quote from someone from an interview. And you also hear this. I mean, there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that I could tell you, like from talking to people. I mean, I was even talking to a person from the ministry, from a Bavarian ministry, and she said it's terrible that the algorithms take all this decision. Where's all the empathy? And I found it quite interesting that a person like working in the ministry, which is after all a very bureaucratic unit, supposedly, you know, like misses empathy in decision making, because of course the question is, what does it mean, right? Does it mean that in some cases I can say, well, look, I'm going to change rules, so you might be eligible to, or you might not be eligible to getting the money, but still you're a nice person, I will give it to it. So it's an ambiguous concept in a way, but you can still see, like, that people seem to care very much about this issue. And you can also find it in the title of some books, for instance, Insel, how algorithms could bring empathy back to medicine. And Topol says that as machines get smarter and take over more tasks, people must become even more human to compensate. So what is actually this component, you know, that people miss in algorithmic decision making? This is actually what we were after in this study, and the reason why we turned, you know, like to experiments, so to say, to behavioral research, is that people cannot really articulate this, right? So if we ask them, so what's the problem, they cannot really. It's like with this person from the ministry, she couldn't really explain what she meant when I was trying to understand. So the assumption here is, or my argument is, that we need more sophisticated methods than just asking people to understand and find out what the problem here actually is. And we're trying to get at this in an experimental design. So let me briefly explain you what we did. So we had people come to the lab, and these people were randomly allocated to one of two roles, and we assigned them in the relation 2:1 to the role of a worker or a decider. And the workers were then randomly assigned to work in pairs, and each pair was allocated one decider. So one decider was responsible for two workers. And this is the famous, you know, like a famous real effort tasks, a task that experimental economists like to use. It's very tedious, so people have to place the slider in the middle of the scale exactly to the 50 position. That's very difficult and cumbersome to do. And for each correctly solved slider, you know, like people get a certain piece rate, a certain amount of money, for instance, 10 cents or €1, because they've successfully achieved to put the slider in the middle. And that's something that people, you know, like it's not really fun to do that, right? So it's why we call it a tedious task. So two people do that, right? And they may perform differently. One person may be really good at it and also very motivated, while the other person, you know, tries to solve 5 sliders and say, the heck with it, and just stop doing that. However, you know, like the money that they earn, the joint amount of money that they earned, it goes into one pot. So they produce one joint pot of money. And then, of course, the ethically relevant question here is the fairness issue, right? So how should the money in the pot be distributed among these two workers, right? So this is basically the paradigm that we are using in this study. And everything is known in advance, right? So we are not surprising people with anything that we are doing in the experiment. And this is, you know, like this is an overview of the treatments and the design that we're using. So let me take you by the hand and lead you through that. So here we have the workers, right? So the workers are waiting for their moment to start working, and we have the decider. So remember again, two workers get allocated one decider, and the deciders look at the situation. So the deciders know everything ex ante, right? So they know the workers will soon work on this tedious tasks. They also have an impression of what this task is about. They can try it out themselves, right? That they understand what the workers have to do here. And then, of course, certain principles, certain fairness principles come to mind, right? You could say, well, let's use a merit-based principle. So if one person works more, twice as much as the other person, then this person should get twice as much money, right? That's in the pot. So proportionality, basically. You could also say, well, they've both given their best, I assume. So let's just distribute the money in the pot equally. Yeah. Or you could, of course, also say the winner takes it all, right? That's what I like. Yeah, I take the money from the pot and give it to the one who has just solved more sliders. Yeah. And the deciders, notice that the deciders choose this fairness principle ex ante, right? Because before any worker has started working. So they look at the situation and they say what they find, you know, the most appropriate fairness principle. So every decider gives his or her vote, and then one of these votes is randomly drawn, right? And this is the one that gets implemented. You could also impose the majority rule, but we just picked one of these, one of the fairness principles that were actually chosen, and we said, well, this is now the fairness principle that we will apply. However, you know, like the workers do not know the fairness principle that is chosen. They're behind a veil of ignorance, right? They do not know the fairness principle. They just know that I soon have to work, and they will assume, I guess, that deciders will vote for a fairness principle that will somehow, you know, not punish them for working more, right? That would be a very awkward fairness principle if they say the loser gets it all or something like that. So that's all we assume in the experiment. And then, they move to the second stage where they actually start working. So they both invest effort, right? And they both put money in the joint pool. And we even have a random device which arbitrarily doubles the amount of money of one person. So assume this person solves 10 sliders, this person solves 20 sliders, and then the random draw selects this person, and this person has suddenly solved 40, right? That's just by a strike of luck. And then, like their joint money goes into the pool, right? And then what we look at, we are now looking at what the deciders what the deciders can do, right? And we are using two variants of deciders. We are using a human decider, and what the human decider can do is the human decider can apply the fairness principle, right, as determined ex ante, or the human decider can, in face of the actual efforts invested and the actual multiplication, like of one of the efforts, can, in light of the concrete outcome of the work, decide differently. Just discard, the fairness principle and say, well, we have a fairness principle here that says a merit-based principle, but actually you're so close, and and then this amount got doubled, and I don't think that's really fair. So we should equally split it, right? Just from a spontaneous, just by a spontaneous idea, this person could discard the fairness principle and go for any other distribution, and select the own distribution and apply that to the specific case, right? And how do we influence this in our experiment? Well, what the human will do is we pay the decider differently in two treatments, right? There is one treatment where we give the decider a flat pay if the fairness principle is applied. And we also give this decider a flat pay if the person changes the rule, right? So put differently, this person can do whatever she wants. It won't make a difference for her payment. So in any case, she gets a flat pay payment. So whether she sticks to the rule or whether she changes the rule, the fairness principle, is completely up to her, right? She has no disadvantage from switching the rule, but she also has no disadvantage from sticking to the fairness principle, right? All she can do is decide in light of the specific work efforts whether she wants to change the rule, right? And then we have another treatment, which we call the rule-bound human. And the rule-bound human only gets a payoff if she sticks to the fairness principle. So notice she can still apply her own distribution principle in light of a specific result, but she has a monetary disincentive to do so, right? Because she will lose her endowment, right? If she does. But still, I mean, she has freedom of will. I mean, she can still discard the fairness principle. And it is only in case of what we call the rule-bound algorithm that the fairness principle will certainly be applied to the specific case. So all the algorithm does is the algorithm applies the fairness principle that humans have decided upon. So there's not any sort of opacity involved here, that the algorithm is self-learning and comes up with its own strange way how to distribute this money, but it's a man-made a decision that humans have taken ex ante, and it's only what the algorithm does is only applying this principle, like to a specific situation, right? And that's basically the three variants that we are using and that we are comparing. We employ two studies, and in each study, the workers can choose between two of the three regimes that I just introduced, right? So we are giving them a choice between these three regimes, basically. And notice what the workers express when they choose themselves into a certain regime is they express a preference over a procedure. They are not expressing a preference about the specific rule. Why? Because they don't know the rule, right? They don't know the fairness principle that has been picked, that the deciders have been chosen. Everything they know is, I choose between a regime where there is a human who can discard the fairness principle in light of a specific result. Or I choose a regime in which there is a human who can, in principle, discard the fairness principle, right? But who will have a disincentive to do so, or there is an algorithm who will just apply this fairness principle to a specific case, right? That's basically the three settings that we are comparing. And of course, in order to make this stronger, if people have a preference for one of the regimes, they will have to pay to get to work under this regime. Otherwise, if they are indifferent, of course, they can say that they're just indifferent, and then they don't have to pay, and they're just randomly allocated to one of them. But if they want to make sure to end up in a certain regime, they have to pay a small amount of money. So the first thing that we were interested in is there an algorithm aversion beyond this opaqueness, right? So even if the algorithm is rule bound, right? Even if we know that the algorithm will simply apply a fairness procedure that humans have decided upon, and that the algorithm just applies to a specific situation, will they still dislike that the algorithm does it? So that's what we go for in study one. So what we compare here is the treatment in which we have a discrete human, right, who gets a flat pay no matter what she does, to the rule-bound algorithm who will surely apply the fairness principle that has been determined ex ante, right? And what we see here is that about 1/4 of people have no preference, so they are not willing to pay to work under the discrete human regime or to work under the rule-bound algorithm regime. But 55%, so most of them have a clear preference, right? About 3/4 have a preference, and 55% of all of them, right? 55% of all of them have a strict preference to work under the discrete human. So the question now asking, of course, is what exactly? Why is this? Why are people willing? I mean, there is a fairness principle. It's the same fairness principle, basically, right? There is no reason to assume that in one treatment, it's the same procedure that the fairness principle was brought about. What exactly do participants miss in the algorithm here? Is it the case? Do we appreciate the presence of a being of flesh and blood in the loop? Maybe to project our anger upon that. So we may say, well, look, even though you have no reason to deviate from the fairness principle, still you're responsible, right? You could have changed it, right? And I hate you for that. So maybe we just need this. Yeah? John Danaher has written this article on the retribution gap, arguing, that the fact that we cannot project our anger reasonably onto machines, drives our aversion, or partly our aversion against them. So maybe this is an explanation. Or do we simply appreciate the fact, the empathy thing, right? That the human being can simply discard the fairness principle in light of a specific outcome, right? And has moral discretion, moral leeway in this sense. And that's the empathy argument, right? The idea that empathy distinguishes us from algorithms that you frequently hear. But that's, in my opinion, never been tested before. So the idea, let mercy yield before justice. But of course, you could say that's a tool. It's not entirely sure whether people think like that. Maybe they just like the human, right? But they don't really like this leeway, like the spontaneity, right? You could also say that, because if they are particularly keen on transparency, right? Because transparency is, at least in the ethicist view, what an algorithm should have, and it's very transparent also for a human, right? If the human is just sticking to a fairness principle that people have voted for, right, ex ante. So it is known that people have cognitive biases, overestimate themselves, and are favorable to the in-group. So the decisions that they make in a particular case, they could just be prone by all sorts of biases. So people may not want that. And there is a nice quote by Lace, during the war. Which makes this point rather clear, that you can also see that there is another side to this coin, where he says, during a time when men are risking their lives to defeat the dictators, some of us should be willing to face certain questions about administrative discretion. This dictatorship is limitless discretion, which is restrained neither by public law nor by conscience. The art of war cannot by itself save us from such tyranny, because that's the idea of bureaucracy. So what we are testing, like in the second study, is basically the rule-bound human versus the rule-bound algorithm. So that's basically bureaucracy versus algocracy. Because if people are keen on the human self, right, they would prefer the rule-bound human, and they would get the best of both worlds, right? It would still be a human. They could say, the human has made the decision, the human is still responsible, we project our anger on this human, and the human was basically, it was likely this is a bureaucrat, that this human, was still sticking, to a fairness principle that was decided upon ex ante. And what we see here is, do people want a human in the loop per se? Well, if we compare, if we give people the choice between the rule-bound human treatment and the rule-bound algorithm treatment, you see that now most people don't have a clear preference. So they're not willing to pay to get in one or the other regime. And if they have a preference, they are undecided, right? So they don't really care whether you put them. Well, sorry. I mean, these people do care, right? But on average, we don't have a clear tendency in one or the other direction. So these people do care, of course, personally, but on average, there is not a clear tendency, right? So what we see here, of course, it really seems that what people want is the fact that in light of a specific outcome, the human can follow his or her own intuition. And this, of course, I would say imposes a major challenge, on decision making by algorithms. If actually what we want is the spontaneity, right, then it will be very hard, I guess I would say, to circumvent this problem. So the problem may run deeper than just like establishing transparency, because people may have a substantial additional problem related to this idea of discretion in moral decision making. Just a final interesting side remark: if we look at the performance, so how much do people actually work under the different regimes, we see that the performance of the participants who were confronted with a discrete human perform significantly worse than those who perform under the regime with the rule-bound algorithms. And we don't see such a difference for the rule-bound human and the rule-bound algorithm. So it seems, that people expect, or may expect that the discrete humans indeed let mercy take precedence over justice, right? Because the fact that there is a human who can spontaneously discard the fairness principle in light of a specific result leads them to work less, right? So I don't want to overstretch this result, but the only note here is, look, the interaction with this regime under which people are working, they have voted for a certain regime, they have selected themselves into a certain regime. The decision regime may very well interact with the performance that people exhibit under this regime. Okay, much shorter on the interaction with robots. So what we have here, the role of being affected, is a vignette study on care robots, and here I'm going to start with the observation that here the ethicists, like the armchair ethicists, so to say, usually have the idea, they have a distaste for these social robots. I think that's fair to say. And the argument here goes that care robots lead to social isolation, they reduce well-being, and they violate the dignity of the care recipients. And the mechanical care, is somehow fake. It's not real. There is human care missing. On the other hand, okay, there are also several authors, of course, who argue the opposite. They say, well, care robots could increase the autonomy of the dependent ones, and these sorts of things, right? I think also here it is interesting to see how people would actually what people would actually say if confronted, if being immersed into these situations, right? And probably do this in a between subjects design, right, where we expose people with a certain situation and then ask them for their well-being, instead of asking them to reflect, like on the contrast between robots and humans. And because the problem is, like this discussion is very much coined by the arguments of armchair ethicists. And of course, you should say, well, we should care at least to a certain degree how those being personally affected, right, by the entity of the caregiver think about that, right, and how their well-being is actually is actually affected by that. So what we do is we employ an experiment with two manipulations. We manipulate the nature of the caregiver, so we see whether it is a human or a robot, and we manipulate the intimacy of the situation. So whether it's a situation of personal hygiene or whether it's just a service scenario in which they bring in a glass of water. Yeah. So what we see here is, if we look at the satisfaction levels, yeah, of the people, and we ask them for how they see this in the care scenario, right, and we let them compare between the human and the robot, what we see is that people are more satisfied with the human, right, caring for them, and they're also more satisfied with a human bringing them the glass of water, right? They are all above, you know, that's maybe the nice message. They are all above the level where they say, I'm still like above the medium level of satisfaction, so I'm not feeling bad in general about that, right? But I just feel better about the human in both cases, in the service scenario and in the care scenario. The interesting thing now is, if we split this, right? So if we look at the people in our sample who are care dependent, right? Who say, well, I am a care dependent person. What we see is there is still some sort of, you know, like a preference, you know, like for the human being, but this is no longer significant, at least in the service case. And what we can see is, you know, that the aversion against the robot, right, or the preference for the human, is stronger for those who are actually in this situation, right? And this is something I think that's very interesting and that we should definitely care about. And this should hint to the fact that very often, you know, it is worthwhile to not only ask, you know, the decision makers, but in a transdisciplinary manner, right, to even include the people who are affected, right? Another interesting finding, and I'll end with this, is that because this is related, I thought I put this in because this is related to the pandemic. If we look at, you know, like people's concern about contracting a viral disease from a human caregiver, what we see is that the more concerned they are in both scenarios, in the care scenario and in the service scenario, the more concerned they are about getting an infection, the less averse they are to the robot, right? So if we truly enter the pandemic age, you know, our preference in that respect may change, and we may prefer the sterile robot instead of the human decision maker. Okay, so let me very quickly conclude. Behavioral research is an important approach to address ethical issues related to human-machine interaction, and it may help us to understand people's intuitions regarding artifacts that are often hard to articulate or unconscious. It can contribute to an ethically aligned design of human-machine interfaces, like if we understand, you know, like how this human-machine interface actually influences human behavior. Think of the small screen and the large screen. And it may challenge, and this is, I think, also what I talked about, the ethicists' intuitions about the importance of some of their favorite topics. So it may help us also to butcher some golden calves, so to say. For instance, the issue of transparency, which plays a huge role. And let me take this opportunity to also hint you to the talk this afternoon to Sebastian Krügel at 5 p.m., who will give what I believe an extremely interesting talk about a bit heretic about the impact that transparency may have on human decision making when it comes to AI-powered moral advisors. So that's about it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very, very much for a very interesting keynote. And we do have some time for a couple of questions, which we fortunately do also have in our live chat on YouTube. So the first question is, do you think the effect observed by Voigtlis et al. 2016, that was one of the papers I think you quoted for the first study, changes with a prolonged exposure with machines?
I don't know. I mean, that's certainly a good question. I mean, you could say, like, once we become more familiar with machines, I mean, the general tendency that we observe here, right, is that people tend to become more to think more in consequentialistic terms, right? And it's something that people like Joshua Green might appreciate. But it could well be that once we get more used to these systems, and we might tend to anthropomorphize them, like in certain domains, that we view them more similar, that we consider them like humans, like over the course of time. So I completely share this intuition that this is what might happen, right? I mean, it's another nice example of whether you want that, right? So you may say, like, depending on your ethics. So I just said, like, Green, would probably say, well, that's a great chance. That's a great opportunity, being a utilitarian, to make us more rational, right? So we should involve these machines as often as possible, and this will help us, like, to overcome our problematic deontological impulses that we all have, even including me, Joshua Green. But a lot of people may say, well, that's not a very good thing. So you could, of course, undertake efforts to keep people in this situation. So for instance, not anthropomorphizing the machine in order to still use this effect. But that's exactly what I was talking about, right? We should be aware about this difference, and then we somehow, irrespective of where we stand personally, we somehow have to deal with it and to take the responsibility that comes with it, right?
Thank you. Also, on the first study, what do you think would happen if there was an option where a machine implements the rule, but some human can, if they wish, override the machine's decision? So this comes back to what we've heard in one of the previous talks of the human on the loop, essentially.
That's an interesting question. I mean, it's of course a very subtle difference, I would say, because what we have basically here is that the fairness principle is basically the default option anyways. I mean, even in the human case, you could say, even in the case of the human decision maker, by making the fairness principle the default option, you could say the technology has already done that, although the technology is implicit. But of course, I completely agree. I mean, there is a difference, albeit a subtle one. And you could, of course, still say, well, if we have explicitly an algorithm, if we frame it like this, and the algorithm introduces it, and the human can then change it, and the incentive of the human, my expectation would be that if we have the human, the discrete human, right, who has has to expect no penalty from changing the rule, people would have no problem with that. Yeah. So I think they would like it better than the rule-bound algorithm as well.
Perfect, thanks. On the second study, what do you think are the reasons for why people prefer a human to provide the service? It's not just the service itself that we're after when we go to a cafe to buy a coffee. So do you think there's a specific reason why that happens?
So I think, like, in the service case, I mean, there were several intuitions around here, or I think there are also, like, in the studies, which are mainly, I think, qualitative studies in that domain. I mean, people come up with certain arguments, and there are, like, opposite intuitions for the care case and the service case, because some people say, well, look, especially if it comes to intimate things, I don't want the machine, right? But other people have a completely different direction. They say, especially if it is about intimacy, right? People may feel less shame if the machine does it, and in the service case, this may be one of the few instances, like getting a glass of water, where you can exchange some words with a human being, right? And so the intuition would be here that it's the social aspect mainly that we want. And for us, it was interesting to see that the affected ones, right, in both settings had a much smaller aversion against the robot, and remember, in the service setting, this aversion was no longer there, basically. So there they were on par with the human. So it's hard to say. I mean, it's just the idea for many people. I think it's uncertainty. I mean, they don't know what it means, and we are afraid of uncertainty. We know what it means. I think most of us were in the hospital, that a human takes care of us, our mother when we were children, or whoever, our wife or our boyfriend. but we don't know what it even means to be taken care of by the robot. Is it reliable? So I think uncertainty plays a huge role here as well. But the thing is, we will not get around this problem, right? Because given the demographic development, right, we have to tackle these questions, right? Whether people like it or not, I guess. Yeah. Because few people are selecting into this job.
Mm-hmm. True, absolutely. I received another question about the first study. Is there any difference in effort between those who are indifferent and those who have a preference for any of the deciders?
No. Yes, we've looked at that. There is no difference. So the results that I was referring to is those, since we have a substantial amount of people being indifferent, right? And we do not see. I mean, we've compared the effort levels according to the preference that people have expressed, being indifferent, having a strict preference for the human, having a strict preference for the algorithm, and they don't differ, right? The difference we observe only when we look at the performances of people who are actually put under a certain regime, right? And that also includes the people who were indifferent. Yeah, that's an excellent question.
Are there any papers on the project you've presented here that people can refer to read up on more details?
Oh, I would ask people to drop me an email, and I can send you. I mean, both projects are still in the working paper phase, and we haven't put them out there. But please feel free to approach me at matthias.uhl@thi.de, and I think that we can certainly find a way to do that.
Perfect. I have another question coming back to your introduction at the beginning and the trapdoor versus pole example, because I was thinking whether there are any thoughts whether a trapdoor by its pure existence already indicates that something is to be dropped down versus the pole, where we've been told from the very beginning, don't push other people in front of trains. Whether this implication of something is to be dropped down anyway factors in here, because that might also have some impact on designs of various programs and algorithms.
Yes, I think that's a really excellent point. Yeah, and I guess you could. I mean, Green hasn't. I mean, Green is not. That's an important point. Green is not making an argument about artifacts or about the ethics of technology. I mean, I just think it's a very interesting line of research, and we can easily see the relation. But it's not that he's explicitly after this point. I guess if he was explicitly after this point, I mean, he would have investigated this. He's far too clever not to do that. But I think that's a really interesting idea, and I could imagine that's something that maybe drives this tendency, right? That we observe here with the artifact, that we say exactly this, right? Also with the action and inaction bias, that we say, well, look, apparently the idea is already in the technology, so it can't be so wrong, right? So I think I agree. I think that this could actually drive the result, at least partly. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe one last question regarding the distributions, because before seeing the whole setup of your study, I was wondering why you actually allocated real workers to do the work. Up to the point of decision of the deciders basically just deciding how payload is to be distributed. Now, assuming we go to something where we have fully automated machines delivering some tasks, maybe based on different algorithms and hence differently effective. And we still have to distribute payment, for example, between two companies. Do you think it makes a difference whether these workers are whether it makes a difference with the deciders, whether the workers are humans or machines? Because you looked at the reverse question, essentially, whether the workers care whether the deciders are human or machine, but what about the other way around?
I mean, in this case, yeah, we had real workers. Just to address this question again, we had real workers because we were ultimately looking for the self-selection choices of exactly these workers. So where do these workers, under which regime do they want to work? Because they were personally affected. I mean, of course, you're right. I mean, you can easily think of settings where they are not even like human workers working anymore, but there is some other, I mean, basically the idea you have in mind is, I guess, a race between ingenious engineers, you know, and it's not, you could say it's still some sort of effort, right? It's just a different kind of effort. So I think as long as people perceive that there is still a human deserving of something, my guess would be that the problem still is similar, because you would still say, well, look, this person was almost as good, or this person was just a bit more ingenious, or whatsoever. So I would assume that it's similar, but I'm not sure. We haven't tested this.
Well, I just got another question here on the chat. Is it ironic that we need to develop robots to care for us, where we think having human is so much more important to us, as it seems to be the case? We should look for ways to have more carers.
Yes, I mean, that's certainly a political issue, which I personally agree. But yeah, I mean, we haven't solved this problem, right? In the past, we're not even able to solve this problem now during Corona, where there's a shortage in the emergency care units is due to a shortage of people. Yeah, I'm not too. I think that's a nice idea. I'm not too confident about that, to be honest. But it is ironic. Yeah, I'd say it is ironic. I agree.
And the situation would probably be different to other job areas that are less liked, I would assume, like garbage disposal and things like this. Or do you think similar theories would apply?
I'm not sure. So I would be very hesitant to. I think what we learned from the study is that there is a huge context dependency indeed, and even though, you know, so my intuitions in such matters have been falsified a couple of times. So I don't feel too confident to say something about that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very, very much for a very thought-provoking keynote and the discussion now. And I think people will reach out to you for your working papers. And yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks a lot for your questions as well.